Good morning and welcome to the Martin Luther King Jr. Alumni Virtual Convocation here at Centenary College of Louisiana. This event is part of Dream Week 2021 here at our college, and becoming the beloved community, a phrase popularized by Dr. King, has been chosen as the theme. My name is Kaylin Walker, and I am the Director of Community Engagement, and I serve as the co-chair of the Diversity Committee here at Centenary. It is my pleasure to participate in this event, which is underwritten by Centenary's Diversity Committee and the Attaway Professorships in Civic Culture. As we begin, I would like to share a brief outline of today's program. After I have completed my opening remarks, Dr. Jema Grove, Assistant Professor of History, will introduce our speaker, Dr. Patricia Matthew. After Dr. Matthew completes the convocation address, there will be a time of Q&A facilitated by Dr. Jefferson Hendricks, who now serves as chair of the English department and as the George A. Wilson Eminent Scholars Endowed Chair of American Literature here at Centenary. During the Q&A portion of the convocation, you may submit your questions in the chat, and Dr. Hendricks and I will manage the chat. After the Q&A session, the Mary Celeste Reagan Award will be presented to our speaker, followed by closing remarks. Please note that this event is being recorded. And for Centenary students seeking passport points, a QR code will be provided at the close of this event. Now I turn it over to Dr. Jema Grove.
Hello. So I am so happy that you're able to attend today, and I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Tricia Matthew. She is currently an associate professor of English at Montclair State University, where she teaches courses on the history of the novel, British Romanticism, and British abolitionist literature and culture. Her work has been published in numerous journals and venues, including Women's Writing, 19th Century Gender Studies, the Keats Shelley Journal, The Atlantic, and Lapham's Quarterly. She's also a specialist in diversity and inclusion in higher education and the editor of Written Unwritten, Diversity and Hidden Truths of Tenure. For the current school year, she's the distinguished visiting professor at SUNY Buffalo's Center for Diversity Innovation. Dr. Tricia Matthew writes widely. One of the works you may be most familiar with is a recent piece that she put out about Shonda Rhimes' new series, Bridgerton. She also maintains a curated blog that covers a wide variety of topics. I'm going to drop both of those into the chat so that you can follow along with Dr. Tricia Matthew's work after. And in the meantime, please join me in welcoming and thanking Dr. Matthew for coming here and visiting with us today.
Hi, everyone. I think you can hear me. I'm not muted anymore. So I'll just get started. Jema, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm glad that you got to Bridgerton. Okay. I'm so thankful to be here. I'm grateful to Kaylin and to Jema and to the Diversity Committee and the Attaway Professorships in Civic Culture for having me. And I'm especially grateful to Jeff Hendricks, not just for helping me get here today, but for everything he's meant to me over the years. He's been my professor, my mentor, and my friend for more years than either of us would want to admit. I'm trying to do work that is worthy of this kind of recognition, and so it's humbling to be part of any celebration that honors Dr. King. And I can't tell you how sorry I am that we won't be here, that we can't be all together sitting on campus. I was going to say sitting in Crumley Gardens, but it's January there too, so it's probably still pretty cold. So when Kaylin asked me last semester to think about the idea of the beloved community, the first poem that came to mind was Lucille Clifton's poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me? I turn to Clifton at various points of any given day for a variety of reasons, and it's meant a lot to me over the course of my career. I also started thinking about other poems of Clifton's that I thought could help us think through the idea of what it means to be a part of the beloved community. And I'll read two of them here to start, and then I'll talk about them. Let me just make my screen, I can't really see, sorry. Okay, so here's the first poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me? Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. The second poem I want to talk about today is Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes, also by Lucille Clifton. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. I've known that first poem. I've had it in my mind. I have it at hand, and I have probably for 15 years. Poems don't change, but our relationship to them change. And so as I was rereading it and thinking about the notion of community and thinking about what it means to be a part of the beloved community, I had to go back and revisit a line that I've been paying attention to in a different way for a very long time. That line is, born both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay. I spend a lot of time thinking about how Black women navigate academic spaces. And those lines have been sort of a North Star for me to understand the challenges and what's been missing. But in rereading them and thinking about the idea of community, I realized that it was the difference between thinking about me individually and me as part of a larger community. And what I learned about community, I learned at Centenary. And even though there were no professors who looked like me when I was an English major at Centenary, even though there were very few Black students on campus, it doesn't mean that I didn't see how I could move through the world. The things that I learned about being intellectually curious, about how to think about knowledge as a path to empathy, how to understand my responsibility to those in my immediate community and those outside of it. I learned from Lucy Morgan what it meant to work in a community, to commit time, and how to treat people and embrace people whose experiences were very different from mine. And I think now about the poem's invitation to celebrate as an invitation into a different worldview and an invitation into understanding that even though our differences are important, I don't believe that we can flatten out our distinctions. I think we will often want to reach for the universal because that's comforting and it means that we're all the same, but that can also ignore the unique things that we each contribute to the world that we live in, and also the experiences that we navigate that get us there. It is different. It is a different thing to be a Black woman in the academy. It's a different thing to be an African-American man moving through the world. It's a different thing to be South Asian in white spaces. It's a different thing to be Native American in a world where when we sing a song, "This land is our land," that means something different. And so the invitation to celebrate is also an invitation to honor and to look and face things that might not make us feel as safe as we'd like, or that might require us to revisit things that we take for granted. I thought about that as I was reading the second poem, Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes. It's short enough, so I'll read it again. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. We're talking about history a lot. I've noticed in every conversation about how we're supposed to move forward in the face of multiple crises, some person, a politician, a pundit, a philosopher says, you know, how will history remember us? How will we be judged by history? And I started to think about the clashes that I see in our culture and the tension that keep us from moving together in a way that can be productive and I think, and hopefully celebratory and strategic, is that there's a clash of memory. When the past president was first elected, I was invited to participate on a literary panel, and I asked that it be called The Long Age of Trump. And here's what I meant, that for Black people, Trump's America had always existed. And that for a lot of white people who were feeling understandably horrified, they were just waking up to a reality that a lot of Black people had lived with for a long time. In other words, it was a clash of histories and it was a clash of memories. And I keep thinking about how so many of the debates that when they devolve into something that is not productive or something that's accusatory, I wonder a lot what's at stake, and often it's memory and how we want to remember the way we got to where we are right now. My students at Montclair State University teach me so much all the time. Sometimes the lessons aren't so great. But I remember a particular moment in class when in my theory class, we were reading a series of essays on race and popular culture. And the sociologist Tricia Matthew was writing an essay, had written an essay about Miley Cyrus and her engagement with Black dance culture. And she started her essay by recounting and sharing her memory of living in North Carolina, and how whenever she was out with her friends, invariably someone would come up, a man, sometimes women would come up and ask her to dance with them in ways that were not about the music. There was a lewdness to it. And she explained that even when she was married and so sort of covered by what happens when you're sitting next to your husband or boyfriend, she still got those requests. My students dismissed her memory out of hand. That could not be true, they said. And because they dismissed her memory, they were unwilling to engage with an argument that was really asking them to think very carefully about the popular culture that they were consuming. And so I let them debate for a while. Was it possible, right? Is it possible for a woman to be at a club or a bar with her husband and have another man come up and make a lewd comment and feel comfortable doing that? We debated that. This is a class in literary theory. We were talking about feminism and patriarchy and marriage as a structure and a construct. And then I asked them this question. I said, what if everything she tells you actually happened? And I asked them to sit and think about what their memories and what their understanding of how the world works, how that shifted and changed if everything she said was true. And I wonder how our world would work and how our communities could be built if instead of responding reflexively, especially to information that challenges what we already know, if we paused and said, okay, what if what the other person is telling me is 100% true? We're in a moment now where I think we can make up history or think that we can make up history, where we can imagine history any way we want. We have sets of facts and we want to treat them all as the same. And one of the things I think is essential to the idea of a beloved community is understanding that we can't just make these things up, but we also can't be more obsessed with being right and winning a debate than we are with being righteous and keeping relationships going. And this is what I mean. I don't suggest that everything goes. I don't believe that there are quote unquote two sides to whatever facts that we face, whatever memory we encounter, whatever way that history is brought before us. I do think we have to allow for the fact that people need to ease their way in, if they're thinking in good faith, that what we're challenging is not facts, but people's relationships to those facts, not history, but people's relationships to those histories. When I went back and read Lucille Clifton's poem, I was confronting not the poem was the poem, it hadn't changed at all, but my relationship to the poem had shifted over time, in large part because of what's happening in national conversations. And so one of the challenges I think that I think it's consistent with the notion of a beloved community, is figuring out a new way to have conversations that are difficult and challenging and to have them in good faith. I know it can be alienating if you believe that you've arrived at a place in the world solely because of your hard work. Maybe you'll admit that you were lucky that you were born into a particular family, but that your hard work and your personality, your wit, your talent, whatever, got you there. It can be jarring to understand that someone else doesn't move through the world in the same way, even if they are working as hard, even if they have had the same luck of your family. It can be difficult to understand or accept that you benefit from a worldview that makes your life easier because of the way the world views your work. And I think we're in a moment when we can invent our own histories, we can invent our own memories. I think of our social media culture, how we curate our lives for Facebook or how we curate our lives for Instagram. We very rarely come out and say, you know, this is exactly what's going on. This vacation looks wonderful, but these things happen. I have a new job, but these things happened at the old job. I'm reading this book, but I'm not actually thinking about the other things that I'm reading or watching. And if we cling to this fantasy about how we arrived, then I don't think we can move forward. I don't think it's an accident that we have new media that is designed specifically to appeal to a particular set of memories. My own gut checks happen if someone presents something to me that lines up perfectly with how I want to see the world. I think, is this actually a true thing that I'm engaging with? Or is it just telling me what I already want to hear? We are asked to remember all the time. That's what this week is, right? We're remembering Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And every year, I feel like there are two competing memories of him. There's the kind of sanitized memory that says that he was a man of peace. And then there are historians, philosophers, people who worked with him, civil rights activists, who want to remind us that that peace came because he was confronting people's memories in ways that made them uncomfortable. That peace is not achieved through a sanitized version of history, but really only when we can confront what makes it complicated, sometimes violent, and sometimes oppressive. The German philosopher, Walter Benjamin, I've been rereading him for another project. In his essay, The Theses on the Philosophy of History, says this: "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule." And I think that some people understand that, and their world works in that way because it has to. And some people can ignore that because their world does not require them to think about it. I think this moment of the George Floyd version of Black Lives Matter versus the Michael Brown version of Black Lives Matter, how we went from that Black Lives Matter being a cause that was embraced predominantly by Black people and people of color to the George Floyd version of those conflicts. I mean, well, there were conflicts, but of those protests that included white people who felt, not for the first time, by the way, certainly not for the first time in history, but who understood that they had to engage in order to participate in ending the crises that got us here. I want to read a final poem, and then I'm really looking forward to talking to Jeff. It's Blessing the Boats. This is also by Lucille Clifton. It's a little bit longer. And I don't talk about it very often, but I have been thinking, particularly in light of our new president and vice president, about how we can move towards a community that doesn't rely on one team winning, like it's a football game or a baseball game, and one team losing, but how we can have new conversations, or old conversations in a new way, so that we're not worried so much about dominating, but in creating connections that recognize that we have to figure out what we're going to do next. I don't think that we can survive as a culture if we continue in the way that we have been. So here's the poem, Blessing the Boats. May the tide that is entering even now, the lip of our understanding, carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love you back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever, and may you in your innocence sail through this to that. I want to read that one more time. May the tide that is entering even now, the lip of our understanding, carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love you back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever, and may you in your innocence sail through this to that. Clifton writes about all manner of subjects, including her position or her experiences as a Black woman and the descendant of slaves. So some of the major tropes and some of the major metaphors in the poem, this idea of a tide that we keep having to return, and we will keep returning. The tide will go out and the tide will come in. The idea that in order to understand something, that the lip of our understanding and to relate to that is to think about how we speak about our experiences and our return to history. The notion of the wind, I teach British Romantic poetry. When I see wind in a poem, I always think of Shelley and the notion of how the wind sort of is a sign of political and social change, right? He says at the end, an ode to the west wind, if winter come, can spring be far behind? She writes, may you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love you back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever, and may you in your innocence sail through this to that. I think that metaphors for boats are always very complicated, but I think in this case, this idea that the sea that we're all on, that we have to navigate, requires us to both confront our innocence and to figure out how we can come to knowledge in a way that's not just about knowing things, but using the things that we know to build the beloved community. Thank you.
Tricia, thank you so very much for that. I really, really appreciate it. It's great to see you again. It has been a few years since you were here at the college, but who's counting, right? So let me let everyone know, if you have a particular question for Tricia, it can be about Lucille Clifton. It can be about the talk that Tricia just made. It can be about the world at large, which I think this talk really expanded beyond the few poems here into where we are now. Feel free to put any question in chat and we will do our best to get that to everyone. I have a beginning question, Tricia, and then we'll see what people put into the chat. Why did you choose Lucille Clifton? And there are many, many poets in the canon and even outside the canon of African-American literature that you could have chosen to talk about. What is it about Clifton specifically that really speaks to you, and why is she the center of this talk?
So partly it's how I came to know her work. I did not read Lucille Clifton in college or even in graduate school. As a new professor, I was taken as a guest to an event to celebrate her work. And I didn't, I'm embarrassed to say this, by the way, I didn't know who she was, but I knew that Toni Morrison was gonna be there and Sharon Olds was gonna be there. Kevin Young was there. There were all of these poets that I did know. And then she stood up to read that poem and she told the story of how it came to be. And the story is that she had won a distinction as by university. She'd been named a professor of arts or professor of letters, and that came with it, you know, what comes with those things. And the man in the office next to her did not feel she deserved it because she didn't have the credentials that he recognized. And as some men are wont to do, he wanted her to know. It wasn't enough that he thought it. He wanted her to know that he didn't think she belonged there. And this was the poem she wrote in response. And so as a young professor, it was just so encouraging to me to understand that someone had come before me and who had had those challenges. And then that moment in that poem when she says, you know, I made it up, right here on this bridge between starshine and clay. So that became a poem that was bracing to me. I started reading everything she'd written, reading it voraciously. And then over time, as my own career has taken different paths than I originally expected, this idea of life being improvised, that if there are challenges to being a Black woman in the academy, if I sometimes feel marginalized, the way that as Bell Hooks says, that the margins are also a place for radical imaginings and for radical possibilities and for radical change. And so instead of worrying so much about trying to fit into an academy that may not have been designed for me, I started thinking more creatively about what I could do with my PhD and the work I wanted to do. And the byproduct of that has been a lot of writing and reading and speaking in ways that I found really productive. It makes me feel as if the training I did within the academy can have an impact beyond it.
Okay, thank you. We have a question. One of the audience members asked if you could repeat and/or expand upon what you said after you read the first poem, and then they quoted, because they dismissed her memory, they were unwilling to ...
Yes, yeah, I'm speaking quickly, I'm sure, and this model of Zoom, I can't see a single person. I mean, I can see Jeff, but I can't see you all. So yes, I'm happy to repeat it. So because they dismissed her version or her history, her memory, they were unwilling to accept her argument about the way that society works and thinks about and engages with Black women in particular, but particularly in popular culture. And so they had made as the fulcrum of understanding her argument the fact that maybe she was lying to begin with. And what I wanted them to do in that moment was just to accept it. Let's just accept if it's true. What does it change about how you think about race, how you think about Black women, and how you think about your place in the world?
Okay, thank you, Tricia. Tricia, something I've always wondered about, I don't know that we've ever talked about this. Du Bois talks about a double vision. And is it possible ever for white people to attain a kind of binocular vision rather than just a monocular vision? Is it possible for us to get outside our own lived experience and to perhaps see and, you know, walk in someone else's shoes?
No. And I'm not even sure if that's the goal. I do, right? I think because the metaphor, right, of double consciousness sort of suggests that they're both equal, right? That they both have an equal impact. And I worry about the idea of having to walk in someone else's shoes as a way to join them, be comrades with them. I do think that I know, because this is my point in terms of having come up in an institution in a community that was predominantly white. I do know that white people can reflect on their lives and how they move through the world in a very particular way that allows them to ignore certain issues or certain realities. And once they realize them, then they can figure out what they're doing and how they might do it differently. I think when I was an undergraduate, and I think I told you this once, Jeff, I didn't understand it until years later, how much my time at Centenary, there were these moments when a white person had gone through this process before having met me. And then when I show up with a question or an idea, where someone who wasn't thinking about my experience might have just dismissed me, they said, oh, okay, let me take time to explain something to this, to this young Black woman. Let me bring her into a space that maybe she doesn't even understand or doesn't know exists. So I think that's better than some idea of where you think that you can, by reading a book or taking a class or spending a lot of time with or seeing a movie, understand someone else's experience as your own. But I do think that I do think that white people can spend a lot more time interrogating how they consume popular culture in particular, because I think it's as powerful as any force, and especially in the United States, how they consume popular culture and how they move with the people around them. How they are, I keep thinking of all of the rioters. They're somebody's uncle, they're somebody's nephew. People turn them in. Their family members turn them in. People sit at Thanksgiving and they sit on porches and they allow certain habits of mind to go unchallenged. And I think it's up to white people to figure out how to have conversations without destroying. And that's what I mean when I say we can't just be right, we have to be righteous without destroying those relationships. But I think we no longer can ignore what's uncomfortable.
Thank you. Here's a question from the audience. Quote, as someone who studies British abolitionist literature, do you see any parallels between that and the current conversation happening around prison abolition with thinkers like Angela Davis?
I first want to say I think we should abolish and defund the police. I'm just going to put it out there. I don't think we should pussyfoot around that. I embrace that. So more than thinking about a single institution like prison abolition, I do think that there are historical patterns of when we confront those questions and how we confront those issues, right? Britain was in had a very different relationship to abolition and thinking about abolitionist culture, in large part because slavery was an institution that it was literally housed in the West Indies. So your average Englishman didn't have to confront slavery in the same way that, say, people might have in the United States. But this idea of what it takes to deconstruct a system, I do see those questions, right? And this is why the term, like in thinking of defunding, and then resistances to abolition, this idea that there are systems in place that keep society in order without challenging or interrogating order for whom and at whose expense. So I would, Angela Davis, of course. Angela Davis's work spans, as an activist and a philosopher, and as an activist, she's confronting institutions in a way that in Britain were confronted as a challenge to as an economic foundation and social practices that were connected, I think, deeply to citizenship. So the challenges might have been the same. What does it mean to be a British citizen? What does it mean to be an American citizen? But I think the institution of slavery and the institutions that Angela Davis is confronting, particularly in prison, where they may have overlaps, I don't know that they parallel in the same way.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go through, we have several questions here. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. How was your experience in graduate school as both a woman and a Black woman? And to combine it with another, how would you compare it with your time at Centenary as an undergrad and how it shaped you, how both of these shaped you?
Well, there were more Black people in graduate school than there were when I was a student at Centenary. And so really for the first time, I found myself in classrooms with other Black scholars and thinkers, all of whom were more politically liberal than I was. And I had an interest and a sense of what was worthy of study that was very different. I love the English department at Centenary. It was at the time a very traditional, canonical education. And so for me, the radical act, for example, was reading novels that I hadn't read in my undergraduate courses. I remember the first time I was in a classroom and people were talking about Victorian literature, and I hadn't worshipped it, but I had not understood it as a byproduct of the colonial empire. So I think here's where I should say that I'm 50 something years old. I graduated from Centenary in the 80s. That makes Jeff really old. But my Black peers had just a more global understanding of how to read literature. And so I had to play a lot of catch up in ways that I hadn't anticipated. So I had been taught to write really well. I had been taught, I grew up and I came up at Centenary to be intellectually curious, and not to be enamored of my own certainty, right? That it's okay to not know. So graduate school was a training in a different kind of way. I will always remember meeting Esther Terry on my visit. I had never seen a Black professor until I got to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And I remember going to her office and she asked me, she said to me, she goes, "Look at you just sitting there." I was sitting, like a church girl. And I just started crying. So it was really, I think it was an experience of not even realizing truly realizing what had been lacking in my undergraduate experience until I saw it as a graduate student. And then by the time I graduated from UMass, I had developed an interdisciplinary group of Black graduate students because we all found ourselves still feeling isolated in Western New England in an institution that was overwhelmed, not just predominantly white, but overwhelmingly white. And so we built a community. And I'll just say one more thing. The thing I loved about it was that it was interdisciplinary. So when we were reading one another's dissertations, I was not simply reading the dissertations of other people who were studying 19th century British literature. I was reading dissertations of people who were studying 19th century African-American literature. I was reading dissertations by people writing about psychology and the psychology of race and education. So I feel like I got a double education in graduate school that a lot of my white peers didn't get because they tended to cohere around the thing that they studied.
One thing I would say is that Centenary is very different now, Tricia, than when you were here back in the late 80s and early 90s, okay? It's much more progressive. It's a very different world. And I think in ways that would make you feel very, very comfortable now if you were a student. Not that we have solved the problems of the world, but we work at it every day and we move forward. I have lots of questions here. Here's one. When you say the word liberal to me, especially in the context of abolitionist movements, that comes with a negative connotation due to inaction. What do you think may be the best way to encourage more active understanding and performance in furthering these goals?
Yeah, I pretty much use liberal as a criticism these days because I think it really speaks to wanting to maintain systems as opposed to deconstruct them. And I think the best radical model, not just in what it attempts, but in how it was formed, was the forming of Black Lives Matter, which was co-founded by 3 women. And it positioned itself as a leaderless movement. In other words, it didn't hold up one single individual whose vision everyone was following, but that I think that made it possible to organize across different coalitions and using different kinds of strategies. I don't know if we need new strategies in terms of challenging. I think that Georgia, and this is where I feel like I'm out of my wheelhouse, but I still have opinions, so I want to frame it in that way. I've been fascinated by what happened in Georgia, and I know that people might not think that has anything to do with abolition, but who makes the choices and who decides what government does, how governance is decided. It really doesn't matter who gets there. And what Stacey Abramson and a group of women have done is astonishing in terms of understanding that there are mechanisms that are already in place that Black people are excluded from. And if you include them in those mechanisms, then change can happen. I think we have to be very realistic about what's possible in organizations. When I use the term defund the police, it doesn't mean that I think that society shouldn't be governed and that there shouldn't be laws, but I do think it's about, we have to reconsider and reevaluate why we give police departments so much money and so much power, and why we keep asking them to do work that would be better taken on by social workers, for example. So in interrogating how the police, I think they're important. I think it's an important institution to interrogate, and in thinking about why we rely on them and what we think we rely on them for. So here's what I mean. After Michael Brown, white people were more likely to see the police as just, right, and reliable than Black people. And this was a article in the New York Times that they did a poll about white attitudes about policing versus Black attitudes about policing. And some of the challenges that white people experience the police as protecting them from something. And what's in that space is Black people, right? We always use the phrase Black on Black crime, for example. We never use the phrase white on white crime, right? We always think about sort of the perpetrator looking a particular way and protecting, and white people think of themselves as being protected from that perpetrator. When we interrogate how policing works, and we didn't do it, we didn't even keep track of what police were doing until after Michael Brown. I think once we know that, I think in understanding those, understanding the functions and where the money goes, what happens when you're arrested if you're white or not arrested versus what happens when you're Black, and understanding that as a function of a system, not individual goodwill. If we understand that people are working in systems, I think that we can start challenging them.
Another question quickly here. I think this is from a white student. Do you have any advice about how to start discussions about race with your family? And especially when it comes to this concept of defund the police.
Yeah. Do you have any suggestions, Jeff?
I would just say be open and try to, since nearly all of my family is much more, frankly, conservative and traditional than some of my views, I think what you told us earlier and encouraged us to do, be respectful and open with other views. I think trying to meet people on their own grounds, trying to figure out what they're afraid of, what they're anxious about, and to try to figure out how to show them that maybe there are ways to deal with that anxiety and that fear in ways that maybe they hadn't thought about. As when I was the age of my college students now, I just yelled at my parents, and that was not good advice.
Well, it's hard when you know everything, right? Like it's hard when you know everything and you're never wrong, which is my challenge in the world. Right? I know everything. I know what's right for everyone. So one thing, I think, and just to go back to the Clifton poem about memory, because I think sometimes, and understanding that some of those tensions are about not just feeling judged, but not feeling smart, right? I think that the fear of being stupid and having someone think that you're stupid or ignorant or unsophisticated or unaware, I think that that's more powerful. And I suspect in families more than even in other spaces, because you have long histories of, I'm an only child, so I'm just imagining this, right? That in other words, there are tug of wars that have been happening in various ways. And then if it's race and politics, those exploded. I think that people respond very well to, and to go back to the structure of the essay, wherein Tracy McMillan Cottom begins with a moment in her personal life and then expands that into a conversation about society as a whole. I think that it's those anecdotal moments that connect people that then you can, over time, talk about how those are connected to what you're learning in your classes, right? If this is a student. I remember fondly being a graduate student and coming home and telling my mother that she was colonized, my grown mother, because I had read Said and I'd read my post-colonial theory, and my mother was a citizen of Suriname, which was a colony of Holland. And when I tell you that she had no interest in that, and that she was fine, and she did not need me to save her, there was no, I don't even know what I wanted her to do. But I think that understanding, and I think maybe it's another way of saying what you just said, but I don't think it's, however, about, I don't think it's about the idea that we always have to be comfortable with new information, right? I mean, I think the first thing is to help people and help our family or our friends understand that sometimes you're just going to feel uncomfortable. Sometimes something that confronts you, and that there's something on the other side of that that may not be comfort, but it is better to know and to think and than to not.
Tricia, I'm going to give you 30 seconds because we're getting the hook from people that are running the show here. We need to shut her down. Folks have other things to do, but I want to give you 30 seconds to, what was your response to the poem read by Amanda Gorman yesterday at the inauguration? And then I'm going to hand it back over to Kalen. He's got some things to wrap it up with.
I loved her, and I heard the poem again this morning, and I loved how expansive it was, just the vision of her, and I was excited again about thinking, I'll say this quickly, and thinking about the notion of a beloved community. I love the community that is around her. I love that Jericho Brown, who I think some of you know. I love that he went on social media when people were trying to maybe be snide and stood up for her and said, nope, this is a young poet. We're going to give her due. Writing occasional poetry is really difficult. I loved hearing that Elizabeth Alexander reached out to her because Maya Angelou had reached out to Elizabeth Alexander. I love that Masha Geshen in the New Yorker sat down and read that poem as a piece of art instead of just an effusion, and analyzed it and respected her for it. So I'm very excited about everything that's happening around it.
Okay, thank you so much, Tricia. President and Connie Holloman, of course, were at the University of Buffalo for so long. They wanted to give you a big shout out and tell you how excited they are that you're there. And I'm going to hand it back to Kalen. Sorry if we didn't get to everybody's questions, but we had a really good crowd today. And Tricia, I look forward to seeing you again soon. I'm going to hand it back to Kalen at this moment. And okay, I'll be going mute and off the video.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Dr. Matthew, for such an inspiring and such a challenging speech today. And it gives me an honor and a pleasure to present the Mary Celeste Reagan Alumni Diversity Award to you on behalf of the Diversity Committee here at Centenary. This special award is named in admiration of Mary Celeste Reagan, who was our first African-American graduate at Centenary College in 1969, 2 months after I was born. I'm going to hold the award up and hopefully people can see it.
It's so pretty. Thank you. Thank you.
Well deserved. Again, thank you, Dr. Matthew. Thank you, Centenary College Diversity Committee members. Thank you, Dr. Hendricks. As we prepare to end our convocation today, I want to share my screen with the QR code for students who need passport points.
Can I just say one thing as you go to share your screen?
Sure.
I missed the order of events. I'm so grateful. And I also think that part of community is remembering that other people did the work to get the space ready for you. And so that part of our job as the beloved community is to make sure that we're doing work to create space for the people who are going to come next. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And as I share the QR code, I just want to announce that we have 2 final events for Dream Week. On tonight at 5 p.m., there will be another webinar with Dr. Stacia Alexander, who will be hosting a challenging conversation regarding social activism and emotional well-being. And on tomorrow, our final event will be hosted by the Multicultural Student Association. And they will allow persons of our community to express themselves regarding the theme, becoming the beloved community. Again, thank you, Dr. Matthew. Thank you all who attended this virtual event. Stay safe and be well.